So I guess in Houston, do we know where exactly, human trafficking is happening? You guys touched on this, but are there some red flags to look for within our communities here? Tanika?
Okay, great. I was like, thank you. I think that, just as an organization that's really focused on educating the community and bringing awareness on the issue of human trafficking, as we spoke of earlier, just the reality that is happening, everywhere in every corner of our city, and not necessarily certain areas of town. I think that's a myth as well. And so I think that's the red flags that you can look for as you're going through your day as an individual who wants to be an advocate for those victims of human trafficking, is really looking for those signs where, if you're interacting with someone, say at a restaurant, and they're not making eye contact, or with someone, they're not really speaking for themselves, and they're, someone is speaking for them, and they feel uncomfortable. If they have tattoos and things of that nature, on their body or their arms and things, because it's a huge part of the kind of the trafficking issue is branding individuals as their property. Okay, and so I know there's a big craze, and young adults have a lot of tattoos these days, but being understanding and aware that that's happening for victims as well. And also just really being able to, understand, do they have the documentation for those who are working? They have, their own passport, are they able to move freely within their environment? Are they always with someone? So like say, the case that we talked about, the Katie case, just really understanding that, people in our communities may be not able to move freely. And I think that really breaking down that myth of them being held hostage, kind of like taken. I think it's important to talk about that here today as well. That is not always the reality, okay? There are trauma bonds that are formed with victims of human trafficking and their traffickers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I think just some of those general red flags of not being able to be by themselves, people speaking for them in a hospital setting in particular, having a translator there, not being able to use their own voice. And just the control that traffickers have over their victims. If you're interacting with individuals who you feel are being controlled by another human being, really being aware of what that really looks like, and maybe asking more questions and engaging that person and talking to them and beginning to have conversations, which is what happens is, in some cases where victims are rescued. So those are just some of the red flags maybe to look for in our community. Maybe someone else can add to that as well.
Yeah, sometimes it's simplistic observational stuff. You go into a nail salon and all the cameras are pointed inward instead of outward. They're not watching to see if they're stealing nail polish. They're watching the employees. So that's probably an indicator of human trafficking. Or, I've never been to a legitimate massage parlor that had reflective mirroring on the outside of it. Most of them that are legitimate, you can look into it and see the front desk. So if it's 9, 10 o'clock at night and there's cars parked out front and people are going in for 15 minutes and coming out, might not be a real massage. So there's just kind of, if it doesn't look right, it probably isn't. There's a, and we're probably going to get to this later, but I'll bring it up now too. There's an app, Harris County Sheriff's Office has it. I'm going to forget the name of it now, but iWatch. You can download it on your phone. You can make anonymous tips and just say, hey, I'm at this massage parlor and it doesn't look legitimate. It'll go to Harris County Sheriff's Office and they can go investigate. So it's just something simple like that. If you're in Harris County, or you can call the human trafficking hotline and report it there and just say, hey, I'm at this nail salon and the cameras are facing inside instead of out. And you can do these small little things as you're going through your day and you notice something that just doesn't seem right. Say something.
And how crucial are tips like that to, fighting human trafficking? What do those go into, kind of catching people culpable?
Yeah, so Taisha can also answer this question, but since they're looking at me, I won't answer. So the human trafficking tip hotline protocol, actually we have the captain from HPD of the human trafficking unit, Captain Dale right here. So hi, Captain. And so basically when the call's made to the tip hotline, it goes to HPD, FBI, and HSI. That hasn't changed, right, Captain Dale? No, it's changed? It's not changed. Okay, perfect. So it goes to HPD, HSI, and FBI. And then if it's a non-law enforcement call or tip, it goes to the YMCA International Service, which has an extensive trafficking victims assistance program, along with other agencies that are here as well. They're not on the tip protocol, the YMCA, and then Taisha can talk a little bit more about that law enforcement response as well.
For us, the public is crucial to us identifying victims and crimes of human trafficking. Because victims, they don't come running and saying, hey, I'm a victim, or reach out to 911 for various reasons, whether they're international victims or domestic victims. So for us, and I'll just speak for HSI, we're not out in the community. We don't actually see what's going on. So we rely on those tips coming in for us to go and conduct a rescue, or just to go out and do a welfare check. And a lot of it is just concerned citizens calling in, even when they don't know exactly what it is they're calling about. They're just calling to say, hey, I observed something. It doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right. Can you talk me through this, or can you send someone out? So it's events like this, the work of UHHT, the mayor's office, the outreach, the awareness that's done is critical to law enforcement response to addressing human trafficking.
One last thing. There's a red flag to watch for as well with young girls. Because classically there is a boyfriend con that is used. So if they have older boyfriends who start giving them expensive gifts, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean that is something, but it is something to watch for, because usually that's the beginning of the trust relationship and drawing them away into a place where they can traffic them.
And I just wanted to say in this, what you were just saying about the young victims, it also speaks to what Mina was saying in terms of the differences between the domestic victims and the international victims. I think there's a misconception that most victims of human trafficking are international victims, non-US citizens. That's just not true. There's a large population of domestic human trafficking victims throughout our nation. And we need people to be aware of that. So young girls who come up with monies and they're not working or making new friends, these are some of the complexities that come with identifying domestic victims. Just wanted to.
And we touched on, some of the myths about human trafficking. I don't know, Tamika, if you wanted to add on to kind of things we discussed already?
Sure. I think, thank you for kind of bringing that piece up when it comes to just the myth of the international versus domestic victims. And I just want to reiterate that, because I think that because of the movies and different things that we see, we want to think this is something outside of our borders and a problem that's being brought here, when the reality it's born here. And that's the reality of when it comes to understanding domestic victims of human trafficking. Also the myth that they're more trafficking victims are women. Because we talk about sex trafficking so much, and actually, labor trafficking. There are more victims of labor trafficking. That conversation at our organization, we focus on trying to continue to make that a part of the conversation. But as we know, the media at times sensationalizes the piece as it relates to sex trafficking, and want to make sure that we're clear that there are many victims of sex trafficking in our communities, but there's also victims of labor trafficking. So emphasizing that, but also that idea that they're actually being chained down in their homes and things of that nature, making sure that we're clear that victims of human trafficking are not chained in a house somewhere. They can be in the store. I want to kind of say something to that, but making sure that there's understanding that this is the myths that are out there, that they are not always true. I think also just making sure that we are clear that there are men out there and young boys that are also victims. I mean, there are young boys that are victims of sex trafficking, just like young girls are victims of sex trafficking, and how critical it is for us to continue to re-message the importance of really supporting our men and boys out there when it comes to this issue of human trafficking, and making sure that we message that correctly. So I think that those are some of the major myths that I would like to share. If anybody wants to add something.
Yeah, and this is tied to it a little bit. There's this myth that strip clubs are okay. They're not. There's this myth that pornography is okay. It's not. And we need to understand that. We need to understand that there's behaviors and activities that minimize women, and they're so harmful, and boys. I mean, they're just so harmful. And when you look at someone who buys someone, they're 270 times more likely to watch porn. 270 times. That's insane. But it tells you something. And if you look at pornography, it's the same as alcohol and drugs. It's addictive. It creates dopamine in your brain, and it rewires your brain, and it creates an addiction to this thing. And when you start to minimize how you see women through the repeated use of pornography at strip clubs, and it changes something in your brain, now it's not that big of a leap to go from watching something on the internet to paying for something and buying something outside. And it's not that big of a leap. And we really have to change the societal view on how we see pornography and how we see strip clubs, because they're both just so damaging.
And I'd like to move on to a question I'd kind of like everybody to weigh in on. What's being done by local institutions to combat human trafficking in Houston?
I can go first and tell you a little bit about what the mayor's office is doing. As she mentioned in the intro, it was the first municipal position created like this in the mayor's office. And so we took about 10 months to do a landscape analysis nationally to basically take stock of every inventory of every program that existed at that time across the United States. We did a local landscape analysis and then did a SWOT analysis with the strengths and weaknesses of the mayor's office and created the city's anti-trafficking strategic plan. So it basically has 5 objectives and 28 strategies and 90 tactics, and we're 89% complete with it at this point. And so the things that we focused on for phase 1 were to institutionalize the city of Houston's response, right? There are departments that are relevant in their day-to-day operations that aren't engaged in the fight to combat trafficking, such as our health department. So our health department has instituted screenings for high indications of trafficking, and then we had to see the continuum through. So we had to make sure we had case managers to receive all of those referrals. And so they just started with the city about 2 or 3 months ago. So one of the other things is we also serve as a balancer of the equation. So we often talk about labor trafficking, and we often mobilize the city departments that could play a role in spotting and reporting labor trafficking. One instance is the food inspectors in the health department as well, and even our Office of Business Opportunity that does all of our contract compliance specialists. Mayor Turner has also signed an executive order for all of the city's purchasing and service contracts to have an impact on labor trafficking beyond our community sometimes. Of course, those vendors are serving the city, but they also have an impact nationally. So recently, we had Bankers Trust, Merrill Lynch, and that EO becomes a part of every city contract. And so we're pushing the conversation out to corporations, which I think for this audience is incredibly important, and we can get to that at the end. So that's an example of institutionalizing the city's response. We also do ordinance work. The second thing we work to do is raise awareness at scale. And so if you go to humantraffickinghouston.org and you go and find our Watch for Traffic website, you'll get a lot of educational content and knowledge about 9 different forms of trafficking that we work to raise awareness about with United Against Human Trafficking, HPD, and the DA's office here. And so there's more than the ones that I listed off to you earlier, and that might be a good place for you to look. The media campaign had TV, radio, billboards, bus signs, taxi signs. It was called Watch for Traffic, and you probably saw one of the images around town. The other thing we do is coordinate victim services, and that ties right back to our case managers that we hired, and we identified 2 gaps. Emergency shelter was a gap. We have a lot of great direct outreach agencies or agencies that do case management but have outreach as a component of their business model, like the Landing and Rescue Houston are here today, and they all do outreach as a part of the way they work. And so they'd encounter people in crises and have no place to place them, or it would be a burdensome task to place them in an overnight shelter. So the city negotiated on their behalf and pays a monthly amount to a shelter system, and they're able to basically place there for free. The city does it. They have very little administrative burden on their side. So we filled that gap. We're already full, so we've got to figure out the other place to build some capacity there. Psychological services was another big gap that we identified early on when we did our needs analysis, and so we obtained funding from the Verizon Foundation to place a human trafficking psychology fellow that offers psych services. One of the case managers we hired is an LPC as well. So that's an example of what we do for the third objective, and the fourth objective was the mayor's task force. We temporarily disbanded it. This is his policy task force. HPD runs a law enforcement task force, so that's separate from that. And our fifth objective was to make sure we became a national model because we were the first city. So we're really pleased to say that Chicago, Minneapolis, and Atlanta's mayor's offices are following suit, and they're funded by the Novo Foundation. And one of the things we do to get our model out there is we'll do high-level speaking engagement. So Mayor Turner is a huge advocate of this issue, and I have a tremendous amount of support for him for all of the kooky ideas that we sort of come up with. Like the executive order, he signed it overnight, and it was on my desk before I got to the office at 8:30. So the fifth objective, Mayor Turner and I have spoken at the United States Conference of Mayors on panels, and we just recently at the June conference, they meet 2 times a year, had a resolution that we proposed with the Social Justice Criminal Justice Committee Chair, which is the mayor of Gary, Indiana, and it went through. So now our next steps for the USCM are to get mayoral sign-on and get some publicity out of that and start to have more of these positions. Because if you look at our impact report on our website, you'll see that they can be incredibly effective if they have that direct report to the mayor.
I'm redeemed for about 6 years or so. But I joined the board this year. My wife was on it before. And what surprised me was most of the money came from the church. So I was in the other camp. I mean, we need to do more with the church, and I agree. But, or faith-based support. But for me, I asked them, are you primarily just a Christian organization? You know, and they said, no, we're Christian people trying to do this work. And so that's when I immediately started an organization of just a gathering of people really to do free marketing, because in this space one of the problems is funding, because anyone who works in this space, a lot of shelters will come and go because as soon as they get close to it, all of your money and effort goes into recovery. You can't even think about going to get help, because every day I describe with Dennis who's here who runs Redeemed, and every time I even can get a coffee with them, there's a baby on the doorstep. And no one's going to the door, and that feeling when you're with people is that way, that there's more to do, there's a lot more to do. But to be able to sustain one of these things is very difficult, because it's so, particularly the area Redeemed is in, is adult American women. And we've never, or if we're in full capacity, that's a problem for the city. Because if someone can't find a place, that's a problem. The other places are opening up, but I think there's a lot more scope for that. And so there's things going on. There's been good things going on, but the challenge is getting the right support. And I think business is a big part of it. So we actually got a little think tank together and started working with all pro bono on how can you message better. So getting them out of the office and saying, okay, let's look at how do we reach the businesses and explain it in a way they can understand and can fund, because it is a complicated issue. And I think what people don't understand is the recovery process. It's more than finding a bed. And that's it. What Redeemed is doing is a very expensive process, but we're trying to go from the standard, which would be a 20% recovery rate after rescue, to up to what they've been hitting, which is about 80%. But that's expensive. And so we need more of that. We're going to, and when I looked at the numbers, I'm thinking the money that our company gives into charitable causes, and I'm like, this is nothing to fix. We just got to find a way to get out to the businesses to understand it and to take ownership in the community, which I think we will. I'm very encouraged about it, because for me, I saw it and I thought it wasn't a difficult problem. It's just learning how to communicate, because the challenge we have is orgs who work in this area work in heavy trauma every day. And if you ask them to tell you about it, you're not going to have a very nice dinner. It is not I said to a bunch of them the other day, we have an oil and gas group, and I said, is everyone used to ruining dinners yet? Are you used to people looking awkwardly? And they get in this almost militant way, but well, that's okay. Yeah, it's not. It's not. We're going to have to find a way to bring it to the surface so that people can do something. And people who get close to it throw their lives into it. But the problem is everyone can't throw their life into it, so we have to find a way to get it so that people can understand it and can do something. We just need everyone to do something, and we'll get somewhere.
speaking. What's being done to support victims of human trafficking in their rehabilitation? I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. So the process, I mean, there's a lot of parts to it. I think the process right now, we do about a year to sometimes year and a half program, and it's a lot of counseling because you have to understand what's happened to them. So I think it's one of those myths that we get caught in, is not understanding. This is a dehumanization process that is going on. It's a very careful psychological breakdown that's happening. And so that transition out it isn't just care, it's actually recovering the human. And the problem is when you start recovering the human, so they go through this process, so when they're kept in fear all the time, usually fear of life is a primary method of managing them. And what that does is causes their brain to stop functioning in a memory mode. And so they're not recording all of this. They're not keeping it, just as if you go through a car crash or you get in anything, you miss the details. That's what they go through. And so what you start doing is unpacking that. Well, what happens is they feel the stress of what they haven't felt. So it's an extreme situation. And so getting them in a safe place. So we actually have a house that we run like a house. And a lot of work and learning has gone into making the program more and more successful. But I think where I'd like Redeem to go is to take what they've learned and transmit it out to others to create the ability for more to do it. And I think they see that the same. But we're going to need funding for that. But that process involves a lot of pro bono people. We have psychologists, lawyers, people who give their own time. And so honestly, the program ran with nobody getting paid for a while. We had to convince them that wasn't a good deal.
Prevention programs in schools. It's difficult at times to get into school to talk about human trafficking, but by the grace of God, we've been able to do that. And so we've discovered just how critical it is for us to be educating parents along with children about what's happening and understanding that trafficking can happen and it is happening. And the biggest pieces we all know, social media and some of the other things that kids are engaged in at a really young age. I mean, I have a brother and I'm like, why does my 9-year-old niece have a cell phone? You know what I mean? So what is that really looking like? And I think that as society shifts, we have to look at our schools and determine what we can do to advocate for our children at that level. But there is work happening here in Houston, and we can talk definitely offline about what we're doing as an organization as well as other organizations.